I will never forget the day Hermann Göring laughed. They said his laughter shook the tables of the Reich Air Ministry in Berlin, loud, arrogant, echoing off the marble walls like a declaration of contempt. He laughed because President Roosevelt had stood before Congress and promised America would build 50,000 airplanes a year. To Göring it was a joke, a fantasy from a country of dreamers who thought automobiles could become bombers. I wasn't in Berlin to hear that laugh, but I heard its echo in every newspaper headline, in every smug remark from those who believed democracy could never outpace tyranny. And that laugh followed me all the way to Detroit. My name is William S. Knudsen. I wasn't a general, not a politician, not even a soldier. I was a factory man, the man Roosevelt called when he decided to arm a nation of peace for a war it could no longer ignore. The year was 1940. France was collapsing, London was bracing for the Blitz, and here at home, we were still polishing chrome on new cars while steel across the ocean was being moulded into tanks. The United States had built just over 3,000 military aircraft the year before, barely enough to fill one German air fleet. Yet Roosevelt's words rang through Congress like a hammer on steel. 50,000 planes a year. Even his advisers doubted him. But when the phone rang at my office, I didn't hear doubt. I heard destiny. They offered me $1 a year to leave General Motors and help lead the greatest industrial gamble in human history. I accepted before they could finish the sentence. I had spent my life teaching machines to obey men. Now I would have to teach a democracy to outbuild a dictatorship. When I walked back into Detroit, the air smelled of oil and disbelief. My engineers looked at me as if I'd brought them a myth. How could a nation that had never built a bomber fill the skies with them? I told them we wouldn't just build airplanes. We would build the system that built them. We would turn every tool, every bell, every pair of hands into a weapon. They thought I was talking about factories, but I was talking about faith. Göring laughed because he thought freedom was fragile. What he didn't understand was that freedom doesn't roar. It hums, it hammers, it builds quietly until the sound becomes thunder. I had no army, no rank, no medals. But that day I was given a front line, not of trenches and fire, but of bolts, blueprints, and willpower, and I swore his laughter would one day be drowned by the roar of 50,000 engines. The numbers were merciless. In 1940, the United States built 3,611 military aircraft, barely a week's output for Germany. We were an ocean away from the war, but I knew that distance meant nothing to time. Every hour we wasted was one the enemy used to prepare. When I stood before the leaders of Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, I told them the truth. Our factories were no longer businesses. They were battlefields waiting to be mobilized. America didn't need automobiles anymore. It needed wings. At first, the room was silent. These were men who had spent their lives perfecting comfort and chrome, not armor and aluminum. But they understood numbers, and so did I. I showed them the math. If every car plant, every tool and die shop, every parts supplier retooled, we could produce more aircraft than the world had ever seen. The challenge wasn't courage, it was conversion. And conversion began with noise. Detroit's symphony changed overnight. The rhythmic click of typewriters gave way to the clang of hammers. Oil replaced perfume. Sparks replaced applause. Conveyor belts once meant for sedans began carrying fuselages. Factories that once smelled of rubber now reeked of aluminum dust. Men and women who'd never seen a cockpit were suddenly learning aerodynamics. Engineers abandoned blueprints for bumpers and drew wing spars instead. We were building something bigger than metal. We were building momentum. I walked through the factories at dawn when the air shimmered with heat and faith. Men worked 20 hours straight, sleeping beside the machines, shirts black with oil, eyes burning with exhaustion and pride. We weren't soldiers, but we were fighting a war of seconds and inches. Every bolt tightened was a bullet loaded. Every rivet driven was a promise kept. We weren't armed with rifles. We were armed with wrenches, calipers, and the will to outrun tyranny. What Germany had in discipline, we would answer with imagination. What they commanded through fear, we would achieve through freedom. By late 1941, the transformation was undeniable. America was no longer idling, it was awakening. The roar of engines echoed from Chicago to Buffalo, a single heartbeat of steel and fire. For the first time, I believed the impossible number, 50,000, wasn't madness. It was mathematics. We no longer sold automobiles. We manufactured time, and every minute, every hand, every spark had to deliver one more plane before the clock ran out. The first months were chaos. Blueprints stacked higher than the men who drew them, engines that wouldn't fit their mounts, rivets cracking under pressure, half the parts arriving late or not at all. Our error rate reached 50%, and even the most loyal engineers began to doubt the dream. They called our effort Knudsen's folly, a polite way of saying madness. And when Ford announced a new factory in Willow Run, a mile-long building meant to produce one B-24 bomber every hour, the newspapers laughed out loud. A bomber an hour, they wrote, perhaps in the next century. But I knew that skepticism was just another form of fear. The truth was, we didn't know how to do it, yet. The B-24 wasn't a car you could stamp from moulds. It was a beast of 4A8193 individual parts, each one demanding perfection. But if we could take 1 million components and make a Chevrolet every minute, then we could take 500,000 and make a bomber every hour. That was the logic I held on to when everyone else lost faith. People called me a dreamer. Maybe I was. But the dream wasn't mine. It was America's. Inside Willow Run, the air shimmered with heat and the smell of cutting oil. The first fuselages hung like unfinished skeletons, cables snaking through ribs of aluminum. We tried everything: hydraulic riveting tools to replace handguns, prefabricated wiring harnesses to save time, pre-assembled modules that could slide into place like puzzle pieces. The failures were relentless. Rivets popped, fuel lines leaked, wings warped under stress. Every morning I walked the line, hearing the same question in every mechanic's eyes. Will it ever work? I'd smile even when I wasn't sure myself. It will, I'd say, because it must. We refined, retrained, re-engineered. We cut the assembly time in half, then half again. We didn't sleep, we didn't stop. Each night the sound of the hammers and drills became a heartbeat. And then, one grey morning in September 1942, it happened. The first B-24 rolled out of Willow Run, ugly, imperfect, patched together like a wounded bird, but it stood on its own wheels. When the engines roared to life, the ground trembled. Men froze, hands still stained with grease, eyes wide with disbelief. The bomber lifted, slow and heavy, into the Michigan sky. For a long moment none of us spoke. The sound of that engine was more than machinery. It was proof that doubt could be melted down and reforged into steel, that belief itself could fly. By 1943, the war had swallowed every able man, and the sound that filled our factories was no longer just the thunder of machines. It was the rhythm of new hands learning an old language. They came by the thousands, wearing overalls too big and courage too quiet to notice. Housewives, waitresses, teachers, secretaries. They stepped through the factory gates and into history. I remember the first morning I saw them lined up outside Willow Run. Hundreds of women with lunch pails and determination, their hair tied in scarves to keep out the oil. Some of the men doubted them. I didn't. I'd seen precision in small hands before, and I knew patience could be stronger than muscle. The newspapers called them Rosie the Riveter, but I saw them as soldiers in denim, armed not with rifles but with rivet guns. Within months, 310,000 women were working across the American aircraft industry. 65% of the workforce at Douglas, North American and Ford's bomber plant were women. They learned fast, faster than anyone expected. When male inspectors checked their work, they found something astonishing. Accuracy rates of 99.5%, defect levels falling from 3.2 to 0.3. The Luftwaffe's analysts called it a sign of desperation, proof that America was scraping its bottom drawer. They couldn't have been more wrong. It wasn't desperation, it was democracy. These women weren't drafted, they volunteered, and freedom, when chosen, always works harder than fear. I walked the lines and watched them move, each rivet a heartbeat, each spark a pulse. They worked side by side, black and white, young and old, their voices mixing with the music of the drills. Some sang, some prayed, all believed. We redesigned tools to fit smaller hands and by accident made them more efficient for everyone. Fatigue dropped, output soared. I saw one woman, Rose Monroe, they called her Rosie, drive 3,000 rivets a shift with 99.5% precision. I watched her wipe the sweat from her brow and smile as if she had just won a battle, and maybe she had. Because every time a bomber took flight, a part of her flew with it. The German report said female labour would collapse under pressure. They didn't understand that these women had been under pressure their entire lives. They didn't break. They built. They didn't march. They made history. They didn't carry guns. But they fired at fascism with every hammer strike. And in the echo of those strikes, I heard something greater than production. I heard freedom, humming in the hands of those who built our wings. They used to mock us. "Will it run?" they said, twisting the name into a punchline. But by 1943, the joke was over. Willow Run had awakened. The factory no longer slept. Its lights burned day and night like a city forged entirely of steel and purpose. Inside, the air trembled with the constant pulse of engines, hammers, and human breath. At first, we built 56 bombers a month, then 100, 200, 300. Every week, the pace quickened. By December 1943, we were producing 365 B-24s a month, one for every day of the year. And by April 1944, the impossible number became real: 428 bombers, one every 63 minutes. We worked in shifts that never ended. When one team went home, another arrived before the machines even cooled. Sparks lit the rafters like fireflies. The sound was endless. Hydraulic drills, steel rivets biting into skin-thin aluminum, the rising hum of engines being tested in the distance. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost holy. We had turned time itself into a weapon. Across the ocean, Göring still laughed. Hitler still ranted about the half-Jewish, half-Negroid Americans, insisting a mongrel nation could never master the discipline of total war. Boetiger, their military attaché, had warned them years earlier, American war production will reach unimaginable heights. They called him defeatist and ignored him. And so, while they hid in bunkers and built jets they could barely fuel, we built bombers faster than they could shoot them down. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 96,270 aircraft, more than Germany managed in the entire war. The statistics no longer measured output, they measured destiny. We weren't just manufacturing machines, we were manufacturing momentum, overwhelming, unstoppable. I walked the length of Willow Run one night, past a mile of humming belts and white-hot welds. The factory had its own heartbeat, steady and alive. I stopped at the end of the line, where a finished B-24 sat waiting to be rolled out into the dark. Its nose gleamed beneath the floodlights, its wings stretched like the arms of a sleeping giant. When the engines fired, the ground shook and the roof panels quivered as if the building itself were proud. I watched it taxi toward the runway, its shadow sliding over the faces of the men and women who had built it. They didn't cheer, they just watched, exhausted and silent, their expressions somewhere between disbelief and reverence. The bomber lifted, heavy but certain, vanishing into the black Michigan sky. And in that moment I imagined Berlin. I imagined Göring hearing that same sound somewhere far away, the roar of 4 engines cutting through the night. Every time a B-24 rose into the clouds, I like to think his laughter died a little more in the noise. By early 1944, the reports coming across my desk no longer read like statistics. They read like weather forecasts of war. The Army Air Forces called it Big Week. In 6 days, America launched 3,500 bomber sorties across occupied Europe. Germany lost more than 1,200 fighters that month, and worse, the veteran pilots who could never be replaced. One Luftwaffe officer wrote later, "They came like rain, endless and cold. We shot one down, and 10 more filled the sky." Reading those words, I understood what our factory floors had become. Not just workplaces, but the front lines of an invisible war. We didn't fly those planes, but every sortie began at a workbench. Every victory started with a wrench. I used to walk the length of Willow Run and imagine each spark, each hammer strike echoing all the way to Europe. By February, we were sending so many bombers that the sky itself seemed to have changed sides. What had once been grey and German now gleamed silver and American. And that was only the beginning. When D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, the numbers were staggering. Allied Command deployed 11,590 aircraft. Fighters, bombers, transports, gliders. against just 319 German sorties, 36-1. The sky wasn't a battlefield anymore, it was ownership. Our planes darkened the dawn over Normandy, waves of wings that turned the clouds into a highway of liberation. I listened to the radio as the first waves crossed the channel. The announcer's voice trembled, not from fear, but from awe. Somewhere in that thunder of engines was the heartbeat of every worker who had given their hands to this cause. I thought of the women on the rivet lines, the engineers hunched over blueprints, the men who never came home from the night shifts. None of us wore uniforms, yet that day we all fought. We fought with time, with effort, with production. I used to believe the war would be decided by soldiers. But when I heard that 11,000 American aircraft had filled the French sky in a single morning, I realized something else. The assembly line had won the battle long before the beaches were taken. When they crossed the skies over Normandy, I knew. The war of machines had ended. The sky had turned American. In the end, it wasn't armies that buried the Reich. It was arithmetic. By the time the war neared its close, our production reports read like a verdict written in steel. 295,959 American aircraft against 94,677 German. Engines told the same story. 812,615 built in America versus 241,675 in Germany. No propaganda could bend those numbers. They weren't boasts. They were tombstones. Each one marked the death of a myth, the myth that tyranny could outpace democracy. When I read the captured diaries after the war, I could almost hear the echo of disbelief. Goebbels wrote, "Göring's promises of air superiority now seem criminally delusional. We fight the world's greatest industrial power with rhetoric." Rommel confessed to his staff before D-Day, "The Americans can lose 10 tanks for every one we destroy and still overwhelm us." And Göring himself, the man who once laughed at Roosevelt's goal of 50,000 planes, finally admitted the truth. When interrogated after the surrender, he said, "That single factory, Willow Run, produced more bombers than our entire Luftwaffe at its peak. It was incomprehensible." I read that line more than once. I'd spent years staring at numbers on production charts, but seeing them through the eyes of our enemies was something else. Their disbelief was our vindication. They had built a system that worshipped violence. We had built one that worshipped creation, and creation won. Hitler believed war was a contest of blood and will. I knew it was a contest of bolts and willpower. The Nazis built weapons, we built the means to build weapons. That was the difference. They believed fear could command efficiency. We proved freedom could outproduce it. I remember once saying to my engineers, half joking, half prophetic, "Gentlemen, modern war is not measured in bullets. It's measured in conveyor belts." When I said it, I didn't yet know how literal it would become. Every belt that moved at Willow Run, every engine that roared to life, every woman who drove a rivet home, all of it formed the invisible front that crushed a regime. Göring later called Willow Run that damn factory that broke our backs. He was right, though not in the way he meant. It wasn't the factory that broke them. It was what the factory represented. A free people, working not out of fear but out of belief, united not by orders but by purpose. I never took pride in the destruction we caused, but I took pride in what it proved, that freedom could manufacture victory. When the guns fell silent, our machines did not. The same furnaces that had poured aluminum for bombers began shaping the skeletons of new homes. The chemical plants that once refined aviation fuel now produce plastics and paints. The machine tool factories that had carved wings and engines turned to building the foundations of peace, washing machines, tractors, the engines of everyday life. The war had ended, but the miracle of production had only begun. We called it the American century, but it was born in the factories of war. The workers who once built B-24s learned to build cities. The women who riveted wings returned home and became teachers, inventors, mothers, and they never forgot the rhythm of the drills. The men who managed assembly lines became engineers, entrepreneurs, dreamers of things larger than fear. I often thought about that, how democracy had done what no tyranny ever could, mobilized millions without chains, inspired obedience without fear. We had found a way to command not through power, but through purpose. Unemployment vanished, incomes doubled. Entire towns had risen from cornfields because of the war effort, And when peace came, those same towns became the beating heart of a new prosperity. We had proved that free men and women, when united by belief instead of compulsion, could achieve the impossible. In those years after victory, I would sometimes walk through the quiet halls of Willow Run. The lights were dimmer now, the belt still, yet I could still feel the echo, the ghost of industry humming like memory. Every bolt, every scar on the floor, every oil stain told a story. We hadn't just built planes, we had built a nation's confidence. People spoke of statistics, 295 and 959 aircraft, they said, as if that number explained it. But I knew better. The true product of Willow Run was not metal, nor fire, nor engines. It was faith, the belief that in a dark and divided world human hands could still build light. I remember standing at the end of the line one last time, watching dust drift through the empty air where sparks once flew. The silence was beautiful. It sounded like peace. They said we produced 295,959 planes. I say we produced something greater, faith itself. Faith that even in the darkest of times the hands of free people could still light up the sky.